She pointed at his truck, and the whole parking lot laughed. That was her first mistake. He didn't argue, he just checked his watch. He had been buying shares in her company for 7 years. She pointed at his truck, and the whole parking lot laughed. That was her first mistake. The parking lot of Ashcorp headquarters gleamed under the late September sun, a sea of polished sedans and electric SUVs. Jennifer Ashford stood at the center of a cluster of executives, her charcoal pantsuit immaculate, her blonde hair catching the light like a helmet. She was mid sentence, gesturing toward the visitor lot, when her eyes landed on the rusted green pickup truck that had just pulled in. The truck was a 1995 Ford F 150. Its paint faded to a patchwork of primer and rust, the driver's side door dented from an incident 3 owners ago. It had a cracked taillight and a mismatched tailgate. It sat among the Teslas and BMWs like a stray dog at a wedding. Jennifer Ashford laughed. It was a polished laugh, practiced in boardrooms and at charity galas, a laugh designed to be heard. She pointed at the truck with her manicured hand, and her executive team joined in, a ripple of chuckles that spread through the group like a wave. They didn't know who owned the truck. They didn't care. It was ugly. It was beneath them. That was enough. Ethan Caldwell sat in the driver's seat, his hand resting on the dinted green metal toolbox beside him. He watched them through the windshield, his gray eyes steady. He was wearing a faded navy blue flannel shirt over a plain white cotton t-shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed brown work boots. His dark brown hair was graying at the temples, and his posture was slightly stooped, as if he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He didn't get out of the truck. He didn't roll down the window. He simply lifted his left wrist and glanced at the worn leather-strapped watch on his wrist. It was 8:47 a.m. He had time. The laughter continued for another 12 seconds. Then Jennifer Ashford turned and walked into the building, her heels clicking on the asphalt, her team trailing behind her like ducklings. The parking lot fell quiet. Ethan Caldwell sat for another minute. He took a slow breath, the kind his therapist had taught him after Sarah died. He looked at the toolbox. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the sunlight. He had been buying shares in her company for 7 years, 7 years, 2 months, and 11 days to be precise. He knew the exact number because he had written it down on the morning of March the 14th, 2016, at 3:47 a.m., when his wife Sarah had stopped breathing in a hospital bed in Seattle. The clock on the wall had read 3:47. The machine had made a single flat tone. The corridor outside had been silent. He had held her hand, the skin still warm, and he had watched the second hand sweep across the clock face for a full minute before he let go. She had been 34 years old. She had been an engineer. She had been the only person in the world who made him laugh without trying. After the funeral, after the house had emptied of casseroles and sympathy cards, after his 4-year-old daughter Lily had stopped asking when mommy was coming home, Ethan Caldwell had sat in his workshop and made a decision. He would not rage. He would not grieve in public. He would build something so quiet, so patient, so invisible that no one would see it coming until it was already too late. He sold his tech company for $47 million. He sold his patents for another $12 million. He sold the estate, the cars, the art collection, everything that reminded him of a life that no longer existed. He bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. He bought the rusted pickup truck from a mechanic who thought he was crazy. He took a job as a maintenance man at the local elementary school. The job paid $38,000 a year. It started at 6 a.m. and ended at 2:30 p.m. It let him pick Lily up from school every day at 3. It gave him evenings to make dinner, to help with homework, to sit beside her bed and listen to her breathe. And in the hours between 10 p.m. and midnight, when Lily was asleep and the house was dark, Ethan Caldwell sat in his workshop and bought shares in Ashcorp. He did it through shell companies. He did it through trusts. He did it through a network of brokers who never saw his face. He bought when the stock was high and when it was low, when the market cheered and when it panicked. He bought with the patience of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. By the seventh year, he owned 23.7% of the company. He wrote that number on a piece of paper and folded it into his wallet. He kept it beside a photograph of Sarah, the one where she was holding Lily in the hospital, her face exhausted and radiant, a yellow ribbon in her daughter's hair. Lily was 11 now. She had her mother's blonde curls and her mother's wide brown eyes. She carried a small stuffed rabbit everywhere, a rabbit that Sarah had stitched a yellow ribbon onto 2 weeks before she died. Lily did not remember her mother's voice, but she remembered the rabbit. She slept with it every night, her fingers curled around its worn ear. One evening, as Ethan tucked her into bed, Lily looked up at him and asked, "Dad, why do you drive that old truck?" He sat on the edge of her bed, the toolbox still in his hand. He looked at the rabbit, at the yellow ribbon, at the dark curls spread across the pillow. "It's a secret, sweetheart," he said, "a good one." She smiled, her eyes already closing. "Is it a surprise?" "Yes," he said, "it's a surprise." He sat in the dark for a long time after she fell asleep. He listened to her breathing, slow and even. He took out the folded paper from his wallet and read the number again. 23.7%. Then he put it back, stood up, and walked to the door. Tomorrow he would walk into the lobby of Ash Corp. He opened the door to his son's bedroom and stood in the dim light, watching him sleep, the toolbox still in his hand. Tomorrow he would walk into the lobby of Ash Corp. The night was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the occasional creak of the house settling around him. Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway of his son's room, his gray eyes fixed on the small form under the blue comforter. The boy was 8 years old, with dark hair that curled at the ends, just like his mother's. His name was Samuel. He was breathing slowly, evenly, one hand tucked under his pillow, the other resting on the stuffed rabbit that sat on the nightstand. The rabbit had a yellow ribbon tied around its neck, hand stitched by Sarah 3 years before she died. Ethan shifted the toolbox from his right hand to his left. The dented green metal was cold against his palm. He had carried it for 5 years now, through every job, every meeting, every quiet moment of planning. It held more than tools. It held the weight of a decision that had been 7 years in the making. He stepped back and pulled the door closed, leaving it open a crack, the way Samuel liked it. The blue nightlight in the hallway cast a soft glow across the floor. Ethan walked to the kitchen and set the toolbox on the table. He pulled out a small leather notebook worn at the edges and opened it to the last page. The numbers were there, written in his precise hand, 23.7%. He had calculated it 3 times, then had his lawyer verify it. There was no mistake. He sat down at the table, the only piece of furniture in the room that wasn't covered in Samuel's drawings or school papers. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a living room. It was a far cry from the glass-walled estate he had sold 5 years ago, but it was quiet, it was safe, and it was his. He thought about the morning ahead, the drive to Ashcorp headquarters, the lobby with its polished marble floors, and the digital stock ticker that ran along the wall, the receptionist who would look at his flannel shirt and worn jeans and see a delivery man. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. He had planned every detail, every contingency, every possible response. But the one thing he hadn't planned for was the parking lot. He had seen her there, Jennifer Ashford, standing beside her black Mercedes, her executive team gathered around her like courtiers. She had pointed at his truck, the rusted green pickup he had bought for $700 from a farmer outside town. She had laughed, a sharp, polished sound that carried across the asphalt. The others had joined in, their laughter a chorus of dismissal. He had stood there, the toolbox in his hand, and he had felt something shift inside him, not anger, not humiliation, something quieter, something that had been waiting for 7 years. He had checked his watch, 8:47 a.m., and then he had gotten into the truck and driven away. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, he allowed himself a small, faint smile. The smile was not for the memory of the laughter, it was for what would come next. He turned the page in the notebook and began to write, not numbers this time, but words, notes for the meeting, the order of the documents he would present, the points he would make, his wife's name, the date of her death, the algorithms she had developed, the one that had saved Ash Corp millions, the one for which she had never been credited, the one that had been buried in a file cabinet and forgotten. He wrote for an hour, the pen moving steadily across the paper. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it back in the toolbox. He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the street. The old truck was parked at the curb, its paint faded, its bed empty. It was a deliberate choice, that truck. It was a reminder of what he had left behind and of what he had chosen instead. It was a statement, even if no one understood it yet. He thought about Samuel, about the mornings they spent together eating cereal at the small table, the boys' laughter filling the kitchen, about the afternoons when he picked him up from school, the way Samuel would run to the truck, his backpack bouncing, his face bright, about the nights when they read stories, Samuel curled against his side, the stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm. This was why he had done it. This was why he had sold the company, liquidated the patents, moved to this quiet neighborhood, taken the maintenance job at the school. All of it was for Samuel. He had not told anyone about the shares, not his lawyer, not his accountant, not the few friends he still spoke to. The only person who knew was Margaret Hayes, the older woman who had been his housekeeper for years, who had watched Samuel when he couldn't be there, who had seen the grief and the planning and the quiet patience. She had never asked questions. She had only nodded when he told her he would be gone for the morning, and she had said, "I'll pick up Samuel from school." He had trusted her with the only thing that mattered. The rest was just a transaction. The clock on the wall read 11:23 p.m. He should sleep, but he didn't feel tired. He felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years. It was not anticipation. It was not satisfaction. It was the quiet certainty that comes when a long road finally reaches its end. He walked back to Samuel's room and stood in the doorway again. The boy had shifted in his sleep, one arm now draped over the edge of the bed. The stuffed rabbit had fallen to the floor. Ethan stepped in, picked it up, and placed it back on the nightstand. He smoothed the yellow ribbon with his thumb, the fabric soft and worn from years of handling. He leaned down and kissed Samuel's forehead. The boy stirred, murmured something, and settled back into sleep. "Tomorrow," Ethan whispered, "tomorrow, it's done." He walked back to the kitchen and turned off the light. The toolbox sat on the table, its dented metal catching the faint glow from the street lamp outside. He did not open it again. He did not need to. The numbers were in his head. The documents were in the envelope inside. The plan was complete. He lay down on the couch, still in his clothes, and stared at the ceiling. The minutes passed. The house settled around him, a familiar rhythm of creaks and sighs. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him towards sleep. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Sarah's face, not the way she had looked in the hospital bed, pale and thin, the machines beeping their slow decline, but the way she had looked in the kitchen of their old house, laughing at something he had said, her hands covered in flour, her hair falling across her face, the way she had looked when she was alive, when the world was still whole. He held that image in his mind and he let it carry him into the morning. The alarm went off at 6 a.m. He was already awake. He showered, dressed in the same flannel shirt, the same jeans, the same scuffed boots. He made coffee, poured it into a thermos, and put it in the toolbox. He checked the envelope one more time, then closed the lid. He woke Samuel, helped him into his school uniform, made him toast and eggs. The boy ate slowly, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Ethan sat across from him, watching, memorizing the way the morning light fell across his face. Dad, Samuel said, his voice small, where are you going today? To a meeting, Ethan said, a short one. Will you pick me up? Margaret will pick you up. I'll be home for dinner. Samuel nodded, accepting this without question. He trusted his father. He always had. Ethan walked him to the bus stop, stood with him until the yellow bus rounded the corner, watched through the window as Samuel found his seat and waved. He raised his hand and waved back. Then he got into the truck and drove toward the glass tower on the hill. The parking lot was nearly empty at 7:30 a.m. He parked in the visitor section, the same spot he had been in the day before. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled. He sat for a moment, the toolbox on the passenger seat, the envelope inside it. He looked at the building ahead, its windows reflecting the pale morning sky. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out the envelope. It was thick, heavy with paper. He held it in his hands for a long moment, feeling its weight. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the morning. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist not yet at her desk. The digital stock ticker on the wall scrolled its numbers, red and green, each one a heartbeat. He walked past the empty chairs, past the leather sofas, past the brass sign that read Ash Corp Headquarters. He pressed the button for the elevator, and when the doors opened, he stepped inside. The ride to the executive floor took 12 seconds. He counted them. The doors opened onto a corridor of polished wood and soft lighting. The boardroom was at the end of the hall. The door was closed. He could hear voices inside, muffled, the sound of a meeting already in progress. He stopped in front of the door, the envelope in his left hand, the toolbox in his right. He took a breath. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Samuel. He pushed open the door. Jennifer Ashford looked up from her seat at the head of the table. Her sharp eyes narrowed, her lips parted, ready to speak. Ethan Caldwell did not wait for her to finish. He walked to the table, set the toolbox down, and slid the envelope across the polished surface. I have a proposal, he said. The room went silent. The boardroom was silent. Jennifer Ashford's hand trembled as she set down the paper. Ethan Caldwell picked up his toolbox and walked to the door. I'll give you until the close of business, he said, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a long moment, no one in the room moved. The papers lay spread across the polished mahogany like a wound that had just been opened. Jennifer stared at the number, 23.7%, and felt the floor shift beneath her heels. She had built Ash Corp from nothing. 15 years of 12-hour days, of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers, of smiling at investors while her knuckles went white under the table. She had survived every challenge, outlasted every rival, and now a man in a flannel shirt had walked into her building and taken everything she thought she owned. The CFO, a thin man named Harrison, who had been with the company since its second year, picked up the document and read it again. His hands were shaking. It's legitimate, he said. Every share, every shell company, the filings are clean. Jennifer did not answer. She was still seeing the man's gray eyes, the way they had held hers, without blinking, the way he had set the toolbox on her table like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had laughed at him in the parking lot. She had pointed at his truck and watched her team laugh with her. She had thought he was nothing. She had been wrong. Ethan Caldwell drove away from Ashcorp headquarters with the toolbox on the passenger seat and the window rolled down. The air was warm and smelled of cut grass. He did not look back in the rearview mirror. He did not need to. The papers were already in motion, and he had learned long ago that some things could not be stopped once they had begun. He drove to the elementary school and parked in the same spot he always did, the one under the oak tree, where the shade kept the truck cool. He was early. He sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the silence, and then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a photograph. It was creased down the middle, the edges soft from years of handling. Sarah looked back at him from a time that no longer existed. her hair longer, her smile wider, her hand resting on the belly that had held Lily. They had been standing in the backyard of a house he no longer owned, and she had been laughing at something he had said, something he could not remember now. The photograph was the only thing he had kept from that life. The house, the cars, the estate, all of it had been sold or given away, but not this, never this. He tucked the photograph back into the glove compartment and got out of the truck. The school bell rang, and the doors swung open, and Lily came running across the lawn with her backpack bouncing and her curls catching the light. She threw her arms around his waist and pressed her face into his flannel shirt. Did it work? She asked, her voice muffled. We'll see, he said. Come on, I'll buy you a milkshake. The diner was a small place on the corner of Maple and Third with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that had not been updated since 1998. They sat in their usual booth by the window, and Lily ordered a strawberry shake and a grilled cheese. Ethan ordered coffee and watched her draw on a napkin with a crayon she had pulled from her backpack. What are you drawing? He asked. Sir, a rabbit, she said, for Mom. She held up the napkin. It was a simple sketch, a rabbit with long ears and a yellow ribbon around its neck, exactly like the one on the stuffed animal she carried everywhere, the one Sarah had stitched for her when she was 3 years old, a week before she had been admitted to the hospital. Ethan looked at the drawing and felt something shift in his chest, a quiet movement that had been there for maybe 3 years and would probably never leave. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The number was still there, written in his own hand, 23.7%. He unfolded it, looked at it for a moment, and then folded it again and put it back. Dad, Lily said, are you sad? No, sweetheart, he said, I'm not sad. Good, she said, and went back to her drawing. At 4:58 p.m., his phone rang. It was his lawyer, a woman named Diane, who had handled the acquisitions for the past 6 years and had never once asked why a man who drove a rusted truck and worked as a school janitor was buying shares in a publicly traded company. It's done, Diane said. The board voted. They accepted all terms. Ethan was sitting on the back porch of his house, the toolbox open beside him, a screwdriver in his hand. He had been fixing the latch on the gate, the one that had been sticking for weeks. He set the screwdriver down and looked out at the small yard, at the garden Sarah had started planting before she got sick, the one he had kept alive out of sheer stubbornness. The fellowship, he asked. Endowed at 5 million. The apology will be read at the all hands meeting tomorrow morning. You have the right to be present. I'll be there, he said. He hung up and sat in the quiet for a long moment. The sun was setting behind the fence, casting long shadows across the grass. From inside the house, he could hear Lily humming to herself, the same tune Sarah used to hum when she was cooking. He stood up, closed the toolbox, and walked inside. The next morning, he put on the same flannel shirt and the same worn jeans. He dropped Lily at school, and she hugged him a little tighter than usual. Good luck, Dad, she said. I don't need luck, he said. I have you. She laughed, and he watched her run into the building before he got back into the truck and drove to Ashcorp headquarters. The parking lot was full. He parked in the same spot he had parked in the day before, the one where Jennifer Ashford had pointed and laughed. He got out, picked up his toolbox, and walked through the front door. The lobby was crowded with employees, all of them heading to the auditorium for the all-hands meeting. The receptionist saw him and her face went pale. She did not stop him. She did not say a word. He took the elevator to the third floor and walked into the auditorium just as the meeting was starting. He found a seat in the back row near the exit and set the toolbox on the floor between his feet. Jennifer Ashford stood at the podium, her face tight, her hands gripping the edges of the lectern. She looked older than she had 2 days ago. The Polish was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. She read the apology first. Her voice was flat, mechanical, like she was reading a script she had not written. She apologized for the incident in the parking lot. She apologized for any disrespect shown to Ethan Caldwell. She said the words, but they landed like stones in still water, each one sinking without a ripple. Then she announced the fellowship, the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Fellowship in Engineering, endowed at $5 million, awarded annually to a young woman from an underprivileged background. The audience murmured. A few people clapped. Jennifer stepped back from the podium, her hands shaking, and looked out at the crowd. And in the back row, Ethan Caldwell held his daughter's hand and smiled. The boardroom was silent. Jennifer Ashford's hand trembled as she set down the paper. Ethan Caldwell picked up his toolbox and walked to the door. I'll give you until the close of business, he said, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and he stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the silence he had left behind. It was a different kind of quiet than the one he carried with him every day. That silence was heavy, filled with the weight of a hospital room at 3:47 a.m. and the sound of a machine going flat. This silence was light. It was the sound of people who had just realized they had been wrong. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened immediately, as if the building itself was now eager to accommodate him. He stepped inside and rode down to the lobby, the toolbox in his hand, the manila envelope empty and folded in his back pocket. The receptionist looked up when he walked through. Her eyes went wide. She had seen him enter the boardroom on the security feed. She had made the call to security, and now he was walking out, calm and unhurried, and the security guards were nowhere to be seen. He nodded at her as he passed. She did not nod back. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish in a tank. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the afternoon sun. The parking lot was bright, the asphalt shimmering with heat. His truck sat where he had left it, rusted and dented, the green toolbox already a legend in this building. He unlocked the door, set the toolbox on the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. He did not start the engine immediately. He sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, and looked at the glass tower in his rearview mirror. Somewhere up there, on the 15th floor, Jennifer Ashford was staring at a piece of paper that told her she no longer controlled her own company. Somewhere up there, the board was scrambling. Somewhere up there, the laugh that had echoed across the parking lot was now a knot in her throat. He started the engine. The truck coughed once and then settled into its familiar rumble. He pulled out of the lot and drove toward Lily's school. The school was a low brick building on the edge of town with a playground in the back and a flagpole in the front. He parked in the visitor spot, the only one that fit his truck, and walked to the main entrance. The clock on the dashboard read 2:47 p.m. He was 13 minutes early. He always was. The hallway was quiet, the classroom still in session. He could hear the murmur of voices behind closed doors, the shuffle of feet, the occasional burst of laughter. He stood by the main office, his toolbox at his feet, and waited. At 3 p.m., the bell rang. Doors opened. Children spilled into the hallway in a river of backpacks and voices. He scanned the flow until he saw her, Lily, with her mother's blonde curls and her mother's wide brown eyes, a small stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She saw him and broke into a run. She hit him at full speed, wrapping her arms around his waist. He set the toolbox down and hugged her back, feeling her small pulse against his ribs. Did it work? She asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. We'll see, he said. Come on, I'm buying you a milkshake. They drove to the diner on Main Street, the one with the red vinyl booths and the jukebox that only played songs from the 80s. They sat in their usual booth, the one by the window, and ordered 2 chocolate milkshakes and a basket of fries. Lily took the stuffed rabbit out of her backpack and set it on the table. The rabbit was old, its fur worn smooth in places, a yellow ribbon tied around its neck. Sarah had stitched that ribbon on. The night before she went into the hospital, she had said it was for luck. Did you show them the papers? Lily asked, dipping a fry in ketchup. Yes. Did they look scared? He thought about it. They looked like they had just realized something they wished they had known sooner. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Good, she said. Mom would have liked that. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It was Sarah, taken in their backyard, her hair pulled back, her face bright with laughter. He set it on the table next to the rabbit. Lily looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and held it close. I told her about the fellowship, she said. At the cemetery, I told her you made it happen. He swallowed. I know, sweetheart. She would have been proud. The words hit him in the chest, a familiar ache. He nodded and took a long sip of his milkshake. At 4:30 p.m., his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was his lawyer. He stepped outside to take the call, standing in the gravel parking lot, the sun low in the sky. The lawyer's voice was calm, professional, but there was a note of something else in it. Satisfaction, maybe, or respect. It's done, the lawyer said. The board voted unanimously. The fellowship is established. The apology will be read at the all hands meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Jennifer Ashford will not be attending. She has taken a leave of absence. Ethan closed his eyes. Thank you. One more thing, the lawyer said. The board wants to know if you'll consider a seat. They think you'd be an asset. No, Ethan said. I have a daughter to pick up at 3 o'clock. He hung up and walked back inside. Lily was finishing her milkshake, the rabbit propped against her backpack. He sat down and looked at her. It's done, he said. She smiled. It was Sarah's smile, wide and bright and full of light. Can we get a dog? She asked. He laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it was real. We'll see, he said. That night he tucked Lily into bed, the rabbit tucked under her arm. He read her a story, the same one he had been reading for 3 years, about a bear who learned to share. She fell asleep before the end, her breath soft and even. He sat in the dark, listening to the sound of her breathing. The house was quiet. The toolbox was in the corner of his room, the manila envelope empty on the dresser. He had made 2 copies of everything. He always did. It was something Sarah used to laugh about. She would say he would back up a sunrise if he could. He stood up and walked to Lily's door. He looked at her sleeping, the rabbit pressed against her cheek, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was something quieter, something like peace. The next morning, he drove to Ashcorp headquarters one last time. He parked in the visitor lot, the same spot as before. He walked through the same glass doors, across the same marble floor, past the same receptionist. She did not laugh this time. She did not even look up. He took a seat in the back row of the auditorium, the toolbox at his feet, the room filled with employees murmuring, curious. At 9 a.m., Jennifer Ashford stepped onto the podium. She looked smaller than she had in the parking lot. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale. She held a piece of paper in her hands, and her hands were shaking. She read the apology. Her voice was flat, mechanical. She did not look at the audience. She stared at the paper as if it were a script she was reading for the first time. Then she announced the fellowship, the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Fellowship in Engineering, $5 million, open to students from low income backgrounds. There was a pause, then someone started clapping, then someone else, then the whole room was clapping, a low rumble that grew into a wave. In the back row, Lily squeezed his hand. He felt her pulse in her wrist, strong and steady. He looked at her, and she was smiling. It was Sarah's smile. It was the smile that had carried him through every dark night, every empty room, every moment he had wanted to give up. He smiled back. The next morning, Jennifer Ashford stood at the podium in the company auditorium, her voice cracking as she announced the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Fellowship. In the back row, Ethan Caldwell held his daughter's hand and smiled. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, employees standing along the walls, the latecomers clustered by the doors. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and nervous anticipation. Jennifer Ashford's hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone, her sharp hazel eyes scanning the crowd, avoiding the back row where Ethan Caldwell sat in his faded, navy blue flannel shirt, and worn jeans, the dented green metal toolbox at his feet. She read the words from a sheet of paper, her voice flat and mechanical. Effective immediately, Ashcorp is proud to announce the establishment of the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Fellowship, a $5 million endowment supporting young engineers from underrepresented backgrounds. She paused, swallowed, and continued. Additionally, I would like to publicly apologize for an incident in the parking lot yesterday. My behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful. I am truly sorry. The apology landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of murmurs spread through the audience. Some employees exchanged glances. A few nodded, their expressions unreadable. Jennifer stepped back from the podium, her face pale, and the CEO of the board took her place, his voice smooth and practiced as he outlined the details of the fellowship. Ethan didn't clap, he didn't need to. He felt Lily's small hand tighten around his, her pulse strong and steady against his palm. She looked up at him, her wide brown eyes searching his face. "Did it work, Dad?" she whispered. He nodded, his gray eyes fixed on the podium where Jennifer Ashford stood, her shoulders slumped, her gold watch catching the light. "It worked, sweetheart." After the meeting, the crowd spilled out into the lobby, the polished marble floor echoing with the shuffle of feet and the hum of conversation. Ethan and Lily walked slowly, the toolbox swinging at his side. Several employees approached him, their faces respectful, their words halting. One young engineer, a woman with dark hair and glasses, stopped him, her voice thick. "I knew your wife," she said. "She was brilliant. She taught me everything I know about algorithm optimization. I never forgot her." Ethan's jaw tightened. He blinked, his eyes wet, and nodded. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening, and walked away. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, the yellow ribbon her mother had stitched on it catching the light. "Mommy was smart, wasn't she?" "She was the smartest person I ever knew," Ethan said. The elevator doors opened and Jennifer Ashford stepped out, her charcoal gray pantsuit immaculate, her blonde hair still perfect, but her face drawn, the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been the day before. She saw Ethan and stopped, her sharp hazel eyes meeting his gray ones. The lobby quieted around them, employees pretending not to watch. "Why the truck?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You could have driven anything. You could have walked in here in a suit and demanded a meeting. Why the flannel? Why the toolbox?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The silver wedding band on his left ring finger caught the light. He thought about Sarah, about the way she used to laugh when he backed up a file twice, about the way she held his hand in the hospital, her pulse weak but steady under his fingers. He thought about Lily, about the way she fell asleep in the truck, her head on his shoulder, her breath slow and even. "Because it reminds me of what matters," he said, "and because I never needed anyone's approval." Jennifer's face tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. She nodded once, a small stiff movement, and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Ethan and Lily drove to the cemetery in the old truck, the toolbox on the passenger seat, the windows down, the summer air warm against their faces. The cemetery was quiet, the grass green, the headstones weathered and old. They walked to Sarah's grave, a simple granite marker with her name and the dates of her life. Ethan placed a yellow ribbon on the stone, the same kind that was stitched on Lily's rabbit. Lily knelt beside the grave, her small hands resting on the grass. "Hi, Mommy," she said. "I got an A on my math test. Dad says you would have been proud. I miss you." Ethan stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the headstone. The wind rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree, and for a moment he could almost hear Sarah's voice, soft and warm, telling him it was going to be okay. He blinked, and the moment passed. A month later, the fellowship was established. The first recipient was a young woman from a low income background, her story a mirror of Sarah's. a brilliant mind, a passion for engineering, a family that couldn't afford the tuition. Ethan attended the ceremony in the same flannel shirt, the same worn jeans, the same scuffed boots. He didn't buy a new suit. He didn't need to. The months passed. Ethan sold a portion of his Ashcorp shares, using the money to fund a small foundation for single parents. He kept the truck, he kept the toolbox, he kept the routine of picking Lily up at 3 p.m., their afternoons spent at the diner, at the park, in the workshop where he fixed things that didn't need fixing. One evening, as the sun set through the kitchen window, casting long golden shadows across the floor, Lily looked up from her homework. Dad, she said, are you done with the secret? Ethan paused, a dish in his hand, the water running in the sink. He thought about the years of quiet accumulation, the shell companies, the documents, the waiting. He thought about the look on Jennifer Ashford's face when she read the shareholder filing. He thought about the yellow ribbon on the headstone. Yes, he said, I'm done. Lily smiled, her small face bright. Can we get a dog? Ethan laughed, a real laugh, the first one in years, the sound of it surprising even him. He dried his hands on a towel and walked over to the table, ruffling her hair. We'll see, he said. Ethan Caldwell drove away in his old truck, the toolbox on the passenger seat, his daughter beside him. He didn't look back. He had already won.